Stone Age house is not at all what you imagine it to be, and now you will find out why. We are used to imagining life in the Stone Age as an endless struggle for survival in harsh and wild conditions. We think that our ancestors lived in primitive, uncomfortable shelters that barely protected them from the cold and danger. However, archaeological findings paint a completely different, much more complex and surprising picture. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn what simple element found in every home was not just a source of heat, but the true center of their universe, around which their entire social and spiritual life was built. The concept of a house in the Stone Age went far beyond a simple shelter from the weather. A dwelling was not just a set of walls and a roof, but an extension of the community itself, its material embodiment. It functioned as a single organism, where each element had its own place and purpose. The space inside the house was not random. It reflected the social structure of the group. Places for sleeping, working, and rituals were clearly defined, creating order in everyday life. This organization helped to maintain harmony and cohesion within the community. The choice of location for construction was part of this thoughtful approach. People were not just looking for a convenient site, but a place with special energy, protected by natural elements. A hill, a bend in a river, or a rock shelter became natural allies of man. The central element of any dwelling, its heart, was the hearth. It not only provided heat and light, but also served as a gathering point for the entire community. Important decisions were made around the fire, stories were told, and knowledge was passed on. Even the smoke from the fire had its own significance, creating a special atmosphere inside the dwelling. It repelled insects and helped preserve food hung from the ceiling. Smoke was an integral part of everyday life, filling the house with life. The boundaries of the home were not purely physical either. It was believed that a dwelling had its own soul and protected its inhabitants not only with walls, but also with an invisible force. The threshold of the home was often perceived as the boundary between the world of humans and the world of spirits. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think was the most important function of a house for primitive man? Physical protection, heat conservation, or creating a center for the community? Write about it in the comments. Thus, the Stone Age house was a complex system where each element was interconnected. It was simultaneously a fortress, a workshop, a temple, and a center of social life. This understanding allows us to see our ancestors not as savages, but as wise builders of their world. Caves were one of the first types of permanent housing for Stone Age people. They offered ready-made protection that did not need to be built from scratch. Strong stone walls and arches provided shelter from wind, rain, and predators. Choosing a cave to live in was not an easy decision. Preference was given to dry, well-ventilated caves with convenient entrances and nearby water sources. Deep, damp underground spaces were not suitable for living. The internal temperature in the cave remained relatively stable throughout the year. In winter, it was warmer than outside, and in summer, it was cooler. This natural microclimate made life more comfortable and predictable. Deep inside the cave, away from drafts, were sleeping areas. They were lined with skins, dry grass, and moss, creating warm and soft beds. Fireplaces were also located in the deeper part so that the heat would last longer. Primitive lamps were used to illuminate the dark corners of the cave. These were flat stones with a depression into which animal fat was poured and a moss wick was inserted. Such a lamp could burn for several hours, giving off a dim but steady light. But caves were not available everywhere, and sometimes people had to build houses from scratch, using the most unexpected materials. In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of building dwellings from the bones of Ice Age giants. Watch the video to the end to find out how mammoth remains were used to create true architectural masterpieces. In the snow-covered plains of the Ice Age, where wood was scarce, people found a unique building material: mammoth bones. Dwellings built from these giant remains are one of the most striking examples of primitive architecture. Such structures are found in areas ranging from Eastern Europe to Siberia. The foundation for such a house was made of massive mammoth skulls dug into the ground. They created a strong and stable foundation for the entire structure. Sometimes large pelvic and shoulder blades were used for the foundation. Vertically placed tusks and large tibia bones served as walls. The gaps between them were filled with smaller bones, forming a dense frame. The entire structure was fastened with sinews or leather straps. The use of mammoth jaws is particularly impressive. They were stacked on top of each other in a checkerboard pattern, creating a patterned and very strong wall. It took up to several hundred bones from dozens of different animals to build one such house. The roof was made of curved tusks, which formed a vaulted dome. They were joined in the center, creating a sturdy arch structure. This frame was covered with large skins, which were held down with other bones. Such a dwelling was incredibly warm and durable. A thick layer of bones and skins provided reliable protection from piercing winds and severe frosts. A fire was constantly maintained inside the hearth, making the house cozy even in the harshest winter. Building such a house required a huge collective effort, collecting and transporting heavy bones, fitting them together precisely, and installing them. All this was only possible with the coordinated work of the entire community. This testifies to a high level of social organization. Inside, these houses were also carefully organized. Archaeologists have found several hearths, pits for storing supplies, and work areas for making tools. Some of the buildings were up to 25 square meters in size, which was enough to accommodate a large family. The purpose of these buildings is still a matter of debate among scientists. Were they permanent dwellings, seasonal hunting camps, or ritual centers? Perhaps they combined all these functions. The only thing that is clear is that mammoth bone houses were not primitive huts, but complex engineering structures. They demonstrate the amazing ability of our ancestors to adapt to harsh conditions and create reliable and durable dwellings from available materials. This architecture was a true triumph of human ingenuity. For many groups of Stone Age hunters and gatherers, mobility was the key to survival. They were constantly on the move, following animal herds or searching for seasonal plants. They needed lightweight, quick-to-build dwellings that could be easily assembled and disassembled. Tents and wigwams were the ideal solution. Their design was ingenious in its simplicity. The frame of such a dwelling consisted of long poles or flexible branches that were stuck into the ground in a circle and tied together at the top. This frame was covered with available materials. In forested areas, they used tree bark, broad fern leaves, or woven grass mats. In more open areas, the main covering material was different. Where there were few trees, the frame was covered with the skins of large animals. The skins were sewn together to form a large canvas, which was stretched over the poles. This covering provided reliable protection from wind and precipitation. The shape of the dwelling was most often conical or dome-shaped. This design was highly resistant to wind. In addition, it allowed for the effective distribution of heat from the central hearth. An opening was always left in the center of the hut for smoke to escape. This was critical for maintaining a healthy microclimate inside. The location of the hearth directly under the smoke hole created natural draft. It took from a few hours to a day to set up such a dwelling. This allowed the community to quickly settle in a new place. When moving to another camp, the frame could be left behind, taking only the valuable skin covering with them. The interior space was small but functional. Sleeping places lined with grass and skins were located around the hearth. Personal belongings and food supplies were stored along the walls. Such lightweight structures were ideal for a nomadic lifestyle. They provided the necessary protection without tying people to one place. This model of housing proved so successful that it was used by many peoples for thousands of years. Creating a shelter was only half the battle. Turning it into a warm and comfortable place was another challenge. In the next chapter, you will learn how ancient people heated their homes. What were the secrets of their central heating? The hearth was the centerpiece of any Stone Age dwelling. It was not just a source of heat, but the true heart of the home, around which all life revolved. Fire provided light during the dark hours of the day, protected against the cold, and scared away wild animals. The simplest hearths were open fire pits directly on the earthen floor. However, over time, their design became more complex. People began to surround the fire pit with stones, which had several advantages. The stone lining prevented the fire from spreading and helped to accumulate heat. The heated stones continued to give off heat long after the wood had burned out. This saved fuel and maintained a comfortable temperature at night. The location of the hearth was carefully thought out. In huts and dugouts, it was placed in the center so that the heat would spread evenly throughout the room. In caves, it could be placed closer to the wall, using the rock as a natural heat shield. Keeping the fire going was a sacred duty. Firewood and other combustible materials were prepared in advance and in large quantities. Not only wood was used as fuel, but also dry peat, dung, and even animal bones, which produced a long and hot flame. All daily life revolved around the hearth. Here, food was prepared, meat was roasted on coals, or soups were cooked in leather bags using hot stones. Clothes, mushrooms, and herbs were also dried here. In the evenings, the whole community gathered around the fire. It was a time for socializing, telling stories and myths. Thus, the hearth was much more than just a bonfire. It was the technological, social, and spiritual center of the primitive home. It was fire that turned a simple shelter into a real home, full of life and warmth. In regions with harsh climates and a lack of building materials, people found another ingenious solution: to go underground. Dugouts and semi-dugouts became a common type of dwelling in many parts of the world. The basic idea was to use the earth as a natural insulator. The construction of an earthen hut began with digging a pit. The depth could vary from 0.5 meter to 1.5 meters, depending on the climate and the groundwater level. The shape of the pit was most often rectangular or rounded. The walls of the pit were reinforced with poles, stones, or wattle to prevent the soil from crumbling. The floor was carefully compacted and sometimes even coated with clay. This made it more even and dry. The roof was the only part that rose above the ground. Its frame was made of thick logs or poles laid on the walls of the pit. The frame was covered with branches, bark, and then a thick layer of turf or earth. Such a living roof not only protected against precipitation, but also served as excellent thermal insulation. In winter, it was additionally covered with snow, making the dwelling even warmer. In summer, the earthen roof protected against the scorching sun. The entrance to the dugout was usually made in the form of a narrow corridor vestibule with steps. This design prevented cold air from entering. The doorway was covered with a heavy skin. The main advantage of the dugout was its ability to maintain a stable temperature. At a depth of 1 meter, the ground has a constant temperature of about +5 or 10 degrees Celsius. This allowed for significant fuel savings for heating in winter. However, living underground had its drawbacks. The main problems were dampness and lack of light. To combat humidity, drainage ditches could be laid around the perimeter, and the light from the hearth and the small entrance was sufficient for lighting. But how did they furnish these simple dwellings and make them truly livable? In the next chapter, we will look inside a Stone Age house and examine its interior. Although the concept of interior design did not exist in the Stone Age, people sought to make their dwellings as comfortable as possible. Comfort was created with simple but functional solutions. Soft and warm sleeping places were the basis of comfort. To create beds, the floor in the sleeping area was covered with a layer of dry grass, moss, or fir branches. This layer served as a kind of mattress, insulating from the cold ground. One or more skins were laid on top to provide additional warmth. Storing supplies and personal belongings was an important task. For this purpose, natural niches in the walls of caves were used, or special storage pits were dug in the floor of dugouts. Such pits were covered with flat stones or wooden planks. Food that needed to be protected from moisture was stored in leather bags or woven baskets. They were hung from roof beams or frame poles. This also protected the supplies from rodents. Primitive furniture was also present in dwellings. Large flat stones or tree stumps could serve as seats and tables. They were convenient for sitting by the fire or cutting up prey. Work areas were organized according to the specific nature of the activity. The place for processing stone, where many sharp fragments were formed, was located away from the sleeping and playing areas. Often it was a well-lit place near the entrance. The walls of dwellings were not always bare. In caves, they were decorated with drawings made with ochre, charcoal, and other natural pigments. In huts and dugouts, the walls could be hung with skins for extra warmth and comfort. All these details show that primitive people cared not only about survival, but also about comfort. They used all available means to turn their shelter into a real home. Their ingenuity in creating comfort is no less impressive than their building skills. Choosing a place to camp or build a house was one of the most important decisions in the life of a primitive community. A mistake could be very costly. Therefore, people were guided by a whole set of strategic considerations based on centuries of experience. The first and most important factor was proximity to water. A clean stream, river, or lake was vital for drinking and cooking. However, people tried to settle on slightly elevated ground to avoid spring floods. The second important resource was fuel. There had to be a forest or thicket of shrubs near the settlement from which firewood could be regularly delivered for the hearth. Without a constant source of fuel, life, especially in winter, was impossible. The availability of raw materials for tools also played a key role. Settlements were often located near sources of flint or other types of stone, suitable for making knives, scrapers, and spearheads. This saved time and energy in obtaining materials. Equally important was the strategic view of the area. Camps were usually set up on the southern slopes of hills or on river terraces. This location provided a good view of the surrounding area, allowing the inhabitants to spot approaching wild animals and other groups of people in time. The southern exposure of the slope offered another advantage: maximum sunlight and warmth. In winter, this helped to save fuel, and in spring, the snow melted earlier here. In addition, this location provided protection from the cold northern winds. People also took into account the migration routes of animals. Many long-term settlements were located near trails regularly used by herds of deer, bison, or horses. This ensured a stable source of food. Protection was another criterion. Rock shelters, narrow gorges, and river bends, all these natural elements could serve as natural fortifications. They created a safe space that was easier to defend. This approach demonstrates how well our ancestors knew and understood the nature around them. They did not live in conflict with it, but in harmony, skillfully using all its advantages to ensure their safety and well-being. In the Stone Age, the home was not only a place to sleep and rest, but also the main center of production. It was here in warmth and safety that all the basic processes necessary for the survival of the community took place. Each dwelling was, in essence, a multifunctional workshop. The main production activities were centered around the hearth. Good lighting and warmth were necessary for delicate work. Stone workers sat by the fire, making tools and hunting implements. The floor around these workplaces is littered with thousands of small flint fragments, evidence of painstaking work. Knives, scrapers, awls, spearheads, and arrowheads were made here. It could take hours to make a single high-quality tool. Another important activity was the processing of hides. After hunting, the hides were brought to the dwelling, where they were cleaned, stretched, and treated with scrapers to make them soft. This process also required a lot of time and skill. The tanned skins were used to make clothes, shoes, and blankets for the dwelling. Instead of needles, they used sharpened bone awls, and instead of thread, they used animal tendons. This was mainly women's work. Inside the house, they also worked with bone and antler. These materials were used to make needles, harpoons, tool handles, and various decorations. Working with bone required precision and patience. Cooking was also a complex technological process. Cutting up carcasses, crushing bones to extract bone marrow, grinding edible roots and grains on stone graters. All this took place inside the dwelling. In coastal areas, the house became a place for processing the catch. Here, fish were cleaned, nets were woven from plant fibers, and bone fishing hooks were made. Stocks of dried or smoked fish were also stored here. Thus, the dwelling was inextricably linked to labor. It was the space where raw materials brought from the outside world were transformed into essential items: tools, clothing, and food. The house was the real engine of the Stone Age economy. The history of housing in the Stone Age is a story of a gradual transition from temporary nomadic camps to long-term settled settlements. This process was slow and uneven, but it fundamentally changed the way of life of humans. It became one of the most important steps on the path to civilization. In the early stages of the Paleolithic era, people led a predominantly nomadic lifestyle. Their dwellings were simple and mobile, light huts or temporary shelters under rock overhangs. They stayed in one place for several days to several weeks. Gradually, with the improvement of the climate and the development of hunting technologies, some groups began to stay in one place longer. Seasonal camps appeared, where people returned year after year at a certain time. The dwellings in such camps became more substantial. The real breakthrough came in the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods. The dwellings in these settlements became more durable and long-lasting. Instead of light huts, people began to build semi-dugouts and above-ground houses with adobe or wooden walls. Such structures could serve several generations. The emergence of settled settlements led to significant social changes. The concept of territory arose, and the social structure became more complex. Life in the village required new forms of cooperation and management. The layout of settlements also became more complex. Houses could be arranged in a circle, forming a central square, or lined up in rows along a street. Public buildings also appeared, large communal houses or ritual centers. A sedentary lifestyle contributed to the accumulation of property and the development of crafts. Pottery, weaving, and more complex methods of stone processing appeared. The house ceased to be just a shelter and a workshop. It became a place to store valuables. This transition was not just a change in the type of dwelling, but a fundamental change in man's relationship with the world around him. Man ceased to simply follow nature. He began to actively transform it, creating his own man-made environment. The architectural legacy of the Stone Age is enormous. It was then that the basic principles of construction were laid down, which are still used today. Choice of location, use of available materials, creation of a comfortable microclimate. Primitive houses were man's first step on the path to conquering the planet. We have completed our journey into the world of Stone Age dwellings. As we have seen, our distant ancestors were not primitive savages, but inventive builders and engineers. Their homes were the result of profound knowledge, collective labor, and an amazing ability to adapt to any conditions. From cave camps and huts to monumental structures made of mammoth bones, each dwelling was perfectly suited to its purpose. They not only provided protection and warmth, but also served as the center of social, productive, and spiritual life. It was in these homes that the foundations of human culture were laid. Studying primitive architecture allows us to better understand not only the daily life, but also the way of thinking of our ancestors. Their legacy lives on in the very idea of the home as the center of our personal universe, a place of strength and security. What other secrets of the Stone Age would you like to uncover? Perhaps you are interested in their art, tools, or beliefs. Suggest topics for future episodes in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into the past.